The American Revolutionary War began in 1775, but the roots of the conflict stretched back many years before the first shots were fired. It was not only a war between armies. It was a struggle over ideas, power, identity, and the meaning of self-government. By the time the fighting ended in 1783, 13 British colonies in North America had broken away from one of the most powerful empires in the world and formed a new independent nation. In the mid-18th century, the 13 colonies along the eastern coast of North America were part of the British Empire. These colonies had their own local governments, assemblies, and traditions, but they remained under the authority of the British Crown and Parliament. Many colonists considered themselves loyal British subjects. They traded with Britain, spoke the same language, and shared many cultural ties. However, tensions began to grow after the 7 Years' War, which ended in 1763. This global conflict, known in North America as the French and Indian War, had been expensive for Britain. The British government faced heavy debt and believed that the colonies should help pay the costs of defending them. Parliament began passing new taxes and regulations on the colonies. One of the first major laws was the Stamp Act of 1765. It required colonists to purchase special stamped paper for legal documents, newspapers, and other printed materials. Colonists protested, arguing that they had no representatives in Parliament and therefore should not be taxed by it. The phrase taxation without representation became a powerful expression of their frustration. Although the Stamp Act was eventually repealed, other taxes followed. The Townshend Acts placed duties on imported goods such as glass, paper, and tea. Colonial resistance grew stronger. Merchants organized boycotts. Public meetings were held. Pamphlets were written defending colonial rights. Tensions between British soldiers and colonists increased, especially in cities like Boston. In March 1770, an event known as the Boston Massacre occurred. British soldiers fired into a crowd of colonists, killing several men. The incident was widely publicized and used as evidence of British oppression. Although tensions eased briefly afterward, distrust remained. In 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act, which gave the British East India Company the right to sell tea directly to the colonies at a lower price. Many colonists saw this as another attempt to assert control. In December of that year, a group of colonists boarded ships in Boston Harbor and threw chests of tea into the water in protest. This event became known as the Boston Tea Party. The British government responded with harsh measures, known in the colonies as the Intolerable Acts. These laws closed Boston Harbor, limited self-government in Massachusetts, and allowed British officials accused of crimes to be tried elsewhere. Colonists across the 13 colonies saw these actions as a threat to their liberties. In response, colonial leaders gathered in 1774 for the First Continental Congress. Representatives from 12 colonies met to discuss their grievances and coordinate resistance. They petitioned the king for redress and organized economic boycotts. At this stage, many colonists still hoped for reconciliation rather than independence. However, events soon moved beyond peaceful protest. In April 1775, British troops marched from Boston to seize colonial military supplies in Concord, Massachusetts. Local militia, known as Minutemen, confronted them at Lexington. Shots were fired, though it remains unclear who fired first. The skirmishes at Lexington and Concord marked the beginning of open armed conflict. The fighting quickly spread. Colonial militias surrounded Boston, trapping British forces inside the city. In June 1775, the Battle of Bunker Hill took place. Although the British eventually captured the position, they suffered heavy casualties. The battle demonstrated that colonial forces could stand against professional British soldiers. Meanwhile, the Second Continental Congress met in Philadelphia. This body began to act as a national government for the colonies. George Washington, a respected leader from Virginia with military experience, was appointed commander of the Continental Army. Washington faced enormous challenges. His army was poorly supplied, unevenly trained, and made up of volunteers from different colonies. Throughout 1775 and early 1776, the question of independence became more urgent. Pamphlets such as Common Sense, written by Thomas Paine, argued that the colonies should break completely from Britain. Public opinion shifted gradually toward the idea of creating a separate nation. On July 4th, 1776, the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence. This document stated that the colonies were free and independent states. It declared that governments derive their power from the consent of the governed, and that people have the right to change a government that violates their rights. The Declaration transformed the conflict from a rebellion into a war for independence. At this point, the colonies faced a powerful enemy. Britain possessed a strong navy, experienced troops, and global resources. The Continental Army struggled with shortages of weapons, food, and clothing. Many soldiers enlisted for short terms and then returned home. Washington understood that survival was essential. If the army could avoid total defeat and continue fighting, foreign powers might offer support. The war soon expanded beyond the colonies. France, which had lost territory to Britain in the 7 Years' War, saw an opportunity to weaken its rival. In 1778, France officially allied with the United States, providing military aid, troops, and naval support. Spain and the Dutch Republic later entered the conflict against Britain as well. The American Revolutionary War was fought not only in major battles, but also in small skirmishes, winter encampments, and long marches. Soldiers endured harsh conditions. One of the most difficult periods occurred during the winter of 1777 to 1778 at Valley Forge. The Continental Army faced freezing temperatures, hunger, and disease. Despite these hardships, the Army survived and improved its discipline and training. As the war continued, battles shifted between the northern and southern colonies. British forces captured cities such as New York and Philadelphia, but they struggled to maintain control over the countryside. In the South, fighting became especially brutal, with loyalists and patriots clashing in local conflicts. By 1781, the war reached a decisive moment. British General Cornwallis moved his forces to Yorktown, Virginia, where he hoped to maintain a strong defensive position. American and French forces surrounded Yorktown by land, while the French Navy blocked escape by sea. After weeks of siege, Cornwallis surrendered in October 1781. Although fighting continued briefly elsewhere, the surrender at Yorktown effectively ended major combat. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. Britain recognized the independence of the United States. The new nation gained territory extending west to the Mississippi River. The American Revolutionary War had reshaped the political landscape of North America. It demonstrated that colonies could challenge imperial power and succeed. It introduced ideas about liberty, rights, and representative government that would influence movements around the world. Yet the war also left unresolved questions. The new nation faced challenges of building a stable government. Slavery continued in many states. Native American lands were increasingly threatened as settlers moved westward. The ideals expressed in the Declaration of Independence would take generations to fully debate and define. The American Revolutionary War was not only a military struggle, but also a profound political transformation. It began with protests over taxes and ended with the creation of a new republic. Through years of hardship, uncertainty, and determination, the colonies became a nation, shaping the course of history in ways that continue to be felt today. After the Declaration of Independence was adopted in July 1776, the war entered a more intense and uncertain phase. The colonies had declared themselves independent states, but they still needed to prove that independence on the battlefield. Britain responded with determination, sending large numbers of troops and ships across the Atlantic to crush the rebellion. One of the central early struggles of this period took place in New York. In the summer of 1776, British forces under General William Howe arrived with a powerful army and a strong navy. Their goal was to capture New York City, which had a valuable harbor and strategic location. George Washington positioned his Continental Army to defend the area, but his forces were smaller, less experienced, and poorly equipped compared to the British. The Battle of Long Island in August 1776 was one of the largest battles of the war. British troops outmaneuvered the American forces and inflicted heavy losses. Washington faced the possibility of total defeat. In a bold and careful retreat, he ordered his army to withdraw across the East River under cover of darkness and fog. This escape preserved the Continental Army, which was essential for continuing the war. Over the following months, British forces captured New York City and held it for the rest of the war. Washington's army retreated through New Jersey, suffering from declining morale and expiring enlistments. Many soldiers were discouraged. Supplies were scarce. It seemed possible that the revolution might fail. In December 1776, Washington made a daring decision to revive the cause. On a cold winter night, he led his troops across the icy Delaware River and surprised Hessian soldiers stationed in Trenton, New Jersey. The victory at Trenton, followed by another success at Princeton, boosted American morale. These victories demonstrated that the Continental Army could strike effectively and survive setbacks. The year 1777 brought new challenges and turning points. The British developed a plan to divide the colonies by controlling the Hudson River Valley. General John Burgoyne led an army southward from Canada, expecting to meet British forces advancing north from New York City. However, coordination failed, and Burgoyne's army became isolated. American forces surrounded Burgoyne near Saratoga, New York. After a series of battles in September and October 1777, Burgoyne surrendered. The victory at Saratoga was a major turning point. It convinced France that the American cause had a real chance of success. In 1778, France formally entered the war as an ally of the United States. French support transformed the conflict. France provided soldiers, weapons, money, and naval power. The presence of the French Navy challenged British control of the seas. Later, Spain and the Dutch Republic also joined the war against Britain, turning it into a global conflict that stretched beyond North America. While foreign alliances strengthened the American position, life for soldiers remained extremely difficult. The winter at Valley Forge between 1777 and 1778 became a symbol of endurance. Thousands of soldiers camped in rough huts under harsh conditions. Food was limited. Clothing was worn thin. Disease spread through the camp. Despite these hardships, Valley Forge was also a time of transformation. A Prussian military officer named Baron von Steuben arrived and helped train the Continental Army. He introduced drills and discipline that improved organization and efficiency. By the time spring arrived, the army was stronger and more professional than before. As the war continued, the British shifted their focus to the southern colonies. They believed that loyalist support was stronger there and that capturing southern ports would weaken the rebellion. In 1778, British forces captured Savannah, Georgia. In 1780, they seized Charleston, South Carolina, taking thousands of American prisoners. The Southern Campaign became a brutal and complex struggle. Regular battles were fought between organized armies, but there were also many smaller engagements between loyalists and patriots. Families and neighbors sometimes found themselves on opposite sides. Violence in the countryside added to the suffering of civilians. American commanders, such as Nathanael Greene, adopted strategies of mobility and endurance. Rather than confronting the British in large, risky battles, Greene divided his forces and engaged in smaller actions that wore down the enemy. Although the British won some tactical victories, they struggled to maintain control over rural areas. Meanwhile, George Washington maintained pressure in the north, carefully preserving his army and coordinating with French forces. The presence of French troops under General Rochambeau and the French Navy under Admiral de Grasse created new opportunities. By 1781, the British Army under General Cornwallis moved into Virginia, seeking a defensible position near the coast. The war had become not only a test of military strength, but also of endurance and political will. The American leadership understood that survival was as important as decisive victory. Each year that passed increased the cost for Britain. The conflict was expensive and unpopular with some in Parliament. The global nature of the war stretched British resources thin. Throughout this period, the ideals of independence continued to shape the new nation. States drafted their own constitutions. Debates arose over the structure of government and the balance of power. Even as battles raged, political leaders worked to create institutions that would guide the country after the war. The American Revolutionary War was not a simple or quick struggle. It involved setbacks, sacrifices, and long periods of uncertainty. Soldiers endured hunger and cold. Civilians faced occupation and divided loyalties. Yet the determination to achieve independence remained strong. As 1781 approached, both sides were weary. The next major campaign would bring events to a decisive conclusion, determining whether the American experiment in independence would endure or collapse under the weight of imperial power. By the year 1781, the war had stretched on for 6 long years. What began as scattered protests and sudden skirmishes had evolved into a full international conflict involving several of Europe's most powerful nations. The American colonies had survived repeated British campaigns, yet the outcome was still not entirely certain. Both sides were tired. Both had spent enormous resources, and both were searching for a decisive advantage. British strategy shifted once again toward the southern colonies. After earlier successes in Georgia and South Carolina, British leaders believed that control of the South might allow them to gradually regain authority over the entire region. General Charles Cornwallis moved his army through the Carolinas, engaging American forces in a series of difficult battles. One of the most significant engagements in the Southern Campaign was the Battle of Camden in 1780. American forces suffered a severe defeat there, exposing weaknesses in inexperienced militia units when facing seasoned British troops. However, the American cause did not collapse. Instead, leadership changes and new strategies helped stabilize the situation. General Nathanael Greene took command of American forces in the South and adopted a strategy of careful movement and calculated risk. Rather than attempting to defeat Cornwallis in one large battle, Greene divided his forces and stretched British supply lines. He allowed Cornwallis to chase portions of the American army across difficult terrain, exhausting his troops and reducing their strength. In January 1781, the Battle of Cowpens in South Carolina resulted in a significant American victory. Clever tactics led to the surrender of a substantial British force under Colonel Banastre Tarleton. This victory weakened British momentum and boosted Patriot morale in the South. Cornwallis continued to pursue Greene, and in March 1781, the two armies met at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse in North Carolina. Although the British technically held the field after the fighting, they suffered heavy casualties. The losses were so severe that Cornwallis could not easily replace them. His army was steadily shrinking. Recognizing the growing difficulty of maintaining control in the Carolinas, Cornwallis moved his forces north into Virginia. There, he hoped to establish a strong defensive base along the coast where the British Navy could provide support and resupply. He chose the port town of Yorktown as his position. Meanwhile, a rare and crucial opportunity emerged for the American and French forces. French General Rochambeau had been coordinating with George Washington in the north. At the same time, the French Navy under Admiral de Grasse was operating in the Caribbean. Communication between these forces led to a bold plan. Washington and Rochambeau decided to march their combined armies south toward Virginia, while de Grasse would sail to block British naval support. The movement of thousands of troops was carried out with careful secrecy. For months, Washington had kept British attention focused on New York, where British forces remained strong. When the Allied army suddenly moved south, it caught the British off guard. In September 1781, the French fleet defeated a British fleet at the Battle of the Chesapeake. This naval victory prevented British ships from reaching Yorktown. Cornwallis now found himself trapped by land and sea. American and French forces surrounded Yorktown and began a formal siege. They constructed trenches and artillery positions, gradually tightening the circle around British defenses. Cannon fire pounded British fortifications day after day. Supplies dwindled inside the town. Escape became impossible. After weeks of siege, Cornwallis recognized that further resistance was futile. On October 19, 1781, British forces at Yorktown surrendered. Although other British troops remained in North America, the loss at Yorktown effectively ended major fighting. News of the surrender traveled slowly across the Atlantic, but when it reached Britain, it had a profound political impact. Many members of Parliament questioned the continuation of a costly war that seemed increasingly unwinnable. Public support for the conflict declined. While formal peace negotiations took time, the momentum had clearly shifted. American independence was now a practical reality rather than a distant hope. During this period, life beyond the battlefield remained complex. The war had affected civilians deeply. Farms had been destroyed. Trade had been disrupted. Families were divided between loyalists who supported Britain and patriots who supported independence. Loyalists faced difficult choices. Many eventually left the United States after the war, resettling in Canada, Britain, or other parts of the empire. Enslaved African Americans also experienced the war in complicated ways. Some sought freedom by joining the British, who had promised emancipation to those who escaped rebel masters. Others fought for the American side, hoping that revolutionary ideals of liberty might eventually lead to broader freedom. Native American nations, too, were drawn into the conflict, often siding with the British in hopes of slowing American expansion into their lands. The war reshaped their futures as well. Even before the final peace treaty, American leaders began addressing the structure of the new nation. The Articles of Confederation had been adopted during the war, creating a loose union of states. Under this system, the central government had limited power. While it allowed coordination during wartime, it would later prove too weak to manage the challenges of peace. As 1782 approached, formal negotiations began in Paris between American and British representatives. Figures such as Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay represented the United States. They negotiated carefully, seeking recognition of independence and favorable territorial boundaries. In September 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. Britain officially recognized the independence of the United States of America. The new nation gained territory extending from the Atlantic coast west to the Mississippi River and from the Great Lakes south to Florida. The war had lasted 8 years. It had begun with disputes over taxation and representation and ended with the creation of a republic built on principles of popular sovereignty and natural rights. Yet independence did not mean immediate stability. The young nation faced economic challenges, political disagreements, and unresolved questions about slavery, native lands, and the balance of power between states and the central government. Still, the survival of the revolution had proven something extraordinary. A collection of colonies, lacking a professional army at the start and facing the world's strongest empire, had endured long enough to secure foreign alliances and ultimately victory. The American Revolutionary War was both a military struggle and a profound transformation in political thought. Its legacy would influence movements for independence and constitutional government across the globe. When the guns fell silent after the surrender at Yorktown and the Treaty of Paris formally ended the war in 1783, the United States stood as a new and uncertain nation. Independence had been achieved, but the work of building a stable country was only just beginning. The war had united the colonies in resistance, yet peace would test whether that unity could endure without a common enemy. Under the Articles of Confederation, the United States operated as a loose union of independent states. The national government had the authority to conduct foreign affairs and manage Western territories, but it lacked the power to tax citizens directly or regulate trade effectively. Congress depended on the states for financial support, and often the states did not provide enough funds. War debts remained heavy. Soldiers who had fought for years were sometimes paid late or in currency that quickly lost value. Economic hardships spread through many regions. Trade networks that once relied on British markets had to be rebuilt. British restrictions limited American access to certain Caribbean ports. Farmers struggled with debt. In some states, economic tension led to unrest. One notable example was Shays' Rebellion in 1786 and 1787, when indebted farmers in Massachusetts protested high taxes and economic conditions. The rebellion revealed weaknesses in the Articles of Confederation and convinced many leaders that a stronger national government was necessary. In 1787, delegates gathered in Philadelphia to revise the Articles. Instead, they drafted an entirely new constitution. The United States Constitution created a federal system with 3 branches of government: executive, legislative, and judicial, designed to balance power and prevent tyranny. It allowed the federal government to tax, regulate commerce, and maintain armed forces, while still preserving significant authority for individual states. The Constitution was debated intensely before being ratified. Some feared a strong central government might resemble the British authority they had just rejected. Others argued that without sufficient national power, the country would collapse into disorder. To address concerns about individual liberties, the Bill of Rights was added in 1791. These first 10 amendments guaranteed freedoms such as speech, religion, and fair trials, reflecting ideals first expressed during the Revolution. George Washington, who had guided the Continental Army through years of hardship, became the first president in 1789. His leadership symbolized continuity between the struggle for independence and the creation of a stable republic. He emphasized unity, cautious diplomacy, and avoidance of entangling alliances. Yet the Revolution's promises were not fully realized for all people. Slavery continued, particularly in the southern states, despite the language of liberty in the Declaration of Independence. Enslaved individuals who had hoped for freedom often remained in bondage. Native American nations faced increasing pressure as settlers moved westward into territories newly claimed by the United States. Loyalists who had supported Britain had largely departed, leaving behind confiscated property and divided memories. The American Revolutionary War reshaped global politics. It demonstrated that a colonial population could defeat a major empire through persistence, alliances, and strategic leadership. The war influenced the French Revolution beginning in 1789, as French soldiers and thinkers reflected on ideas of liberty and popular sovereignty. Movements in Latin America and beyond would later draw inspiration from the American example. Militarily, the war illustrated that endurance could be as powerful as decisive battles. The Continental Army rarely won overwhelming victories, yet it avoided destruction. Washington understood that survival and time were allies. Each year increased the financial and political burden on Britain. International alliances widened the conflict, forcing Britain to divide its attention across multiple theaters. The war also transformed American identity. Before 1775, many colonists thought of themselves primarily as British subjects living in America. By 1783, they increasingly saw themselves as Americans. Shared sacrifice, common struggle, and a language of independence helped forge that identity. The ideals articulated in the Declaration of Independence that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, and that all men are created equal, would echo across centuries. Those words would be invoked by abolitionists, suffragists, civil rights leaders, and reformers seeking to expand the meaning of equality. The Revolution established a framework, but its principles required continual interpretation and expansion. In quiet reflection, one can see the American Revolutionary War not only as a sequence of battles and treaties, but as a turning point in the development of constitutional government. It was a conflict born from disputes over taxation and representation, yet it matured into a broad philosophical movement about rights and authority. The soldiers who crossed icy rivers, endured winters at Valley Forge, marched through southern heat, and stood in trenches at Yorktown could not have fully known how far the consequences of their struggle would reach. They lived through uncertainty, scarcity, and fear. Many did not survive to see peace. Yet their persistence altered the course of history. By the end of the 18th century, the United States was still fragile, still divided in many ways, yet firmly independent. The Revolution had not created a perfect society, It had created an experiment, one that would continue to evolve through debate, conflict, and reform. And so the story of the American Revolutionary War closes not with a single triumphant moment, but with the quiet beginning of a new chapter. A young republic standing along the Atlantic coast, stretching westward toward vast territories, carrying within it both the ideals of liberty and the challenges of living up to them. The echoes of that revolution continue to shape the modern world, reminding us that independence is not only declared on parchment, but sustained through the ongoing work of governance, responsibility, and shared purpose.